The year 2001 cast a gray, relentless pallor over Brookhaven, Maine, at least for Sarah Reed. 10 years had carved canyons into her soul, etched lines of perpetual sorrow around her eyes, and replaced the vibrant hum of life with a quiet, hollow ache. The quaint coastal town, usually alive with the salty tang of the Atlantic and the cheerful chatter of lobster boats, felt perpetually muted to her. She moved through its familiar streets like a ghost, a specter haunting her own grief while the world around her stubbornly, infuriatingly went on. Her small cottage, perched precariously on a rocky outcrop overlooking the turbulent sea, had become her sanctuary and her prison. Dust motes danced in the sparse sunlight that dared to penetrate the drawn curtains, each particle a tiny reminder of the life that had once filled these rooms, a life that had evaporated on a sunny September afternoon in 1991. The framed photographs of a smiling, freckled boy, Jacob, had long since been turned face down or tucked away in forgotten boxes. It was a self-preservation instinct. Seeing his bright, mischievous grin was a cruelty she could no longer endure. The silence in the house was the loudest sound of all, a constant, deafening testament to his absence. It was his 8th birthday, September 14th, 1991. The air had been crisp, carrying the last vestiges of summer warmth, a perfect day for a party. Jacob, all boundless energy and gap-toothed grins, had been tearing around the backyard, his red baseball cap askew, chasing his friends through the makeshift obstacle course his father, David, had built. Sarah remembered the dizzying chaos, the laughter echoing off the ancient oak tree, the smell of grilling hot dogs mingling with the sweet scent of the birthday cake. She'd slipped inside for just a moment to grab more juice boxes, pausing by the kitchen window to watch him. He was clambering over the wooden swing set, his tiny blue toy binoculars, a gift from his grandmother, bouncing against his chest. One moment he was there, a vibrant speck of pure joy. The next, the laughter seemed to thin, the sun seemed to dim. The children were still playing, but Jacob wasn't. Panic, cold and sharp, had seized her. She'd run out, calling his name, her voice rising to a frantic shriek that still haunted her dreams. The neighbors had joined the search, then the police, their flashing lights painting grim streaks across the twilight. The days had bled into weeks, the weeks into months, each passing moment a fresh, agonizing knife twist of certainty that her boy was gone. Now, in 2001, the ache of those memories was a constant companion. Yet, amidst the perpetual fog of her sorrow, a new task loomed. Her grandmother, a spry and fiercely independent woman, had finally succumbed to old age a few weeks prior, leaving Sarah her rambling, centuries-old farmhouse on the outskirts of town. It was a place of childhood summers, of secret nooks and dusty corners filled with forgotten treasures. The executor had called, gently urging her to begin the daunting task of clearing out the property. It felt like another mountain to climb, another obligation she barely had the energy for, but a strange, almost imperceptible pull began to tug in her. A sense of duty, yes, but also a faint, almost imperceptible whisper of something else, something she couldn't quite name, stirring in the depths of her weary heart. Perhaps, in sorting through the remnants of another life, she might find a way to make sense of her own. With a sigh that felt like it carried the weight of a decade, Sarah found her old work gloves and a worn bandana. The attic of her grandmother's house beckoned, a vast, shadowy space filled with the silent stories of the past. The attic door groaned open, a drawn-out lament that seemed to mirror Sarah's own reluctance. A wave of musty, sweet air, heavy with the scent of aged paper, forgotten textiles, and the faint, nostalgic aroma of wood smoke, washed over her. A single bare bulb hanging from the rafters cast a sickly yellow glow, illuminating an ocean of forgotten things. Trunks bound with rope, skeletal furniture draped in white sheets, stacks of old newspapers yellowed with time. Each object seemed to hold its breath, waiting to be rediscovered. Sarah stepped inside, the floorboards protesting with each step, and felt the past pressing in on her. It was overwhelming. Every corner held a fragment of her grandmother's long life, and, by extension, a sliver of her own. She started with the nearest pile, a towering stack of cardboard boxes overflowing with old clothes. The fabric, once vibrant, now felt brittle and thin beneath her fingers. A faded floral dress, a men's tweed jacket with elbow patches, a child's tiny knitted cardigan. Each piece told an unspoken story, a silent whisper of a life lived. She could almost hear her grandmother's gentle humming, smell the lavender sachets she used to tuck into every drawer. She moved deeper into the cavernous space, navigating around stacks of old encyclopedias and a dismantled rocking horse. The dust was thick, a fine, ghostly powder that coated everything, catching the faint light from the bulb and shimmering in the air. Sarah coughed, the dryness in her throat a physical manifestation of the emotional aridity she'd lived with for so long. She found herself mindlessly running her hand over a velvet-covered photo album, its spine cracked, then a stack of old vinyl records, her grandmother's jazz collection. These were benign, comforting ghosts. Then, tucked away in a dimly lit corner, partially obscured by a moth-eaten patchwork quilt, she noticed something different. A small, rather nondescript cardboard box, slightly crushed on one side but clearly distinct from the larger, more organized storage containers. It wasn't neatly labeled like most of her grandmother's things. Instead, it looked almost hastily shoved into its spot, almost hidden. A prickle of unease, faint but insistent, ran down her spine. With a hesitant breath, Sarah pulled the box free. It was lighter than she expected, and as she brushed away the decade of dust, her fingers found no obvious tape or closure. She lifted the flap, and her heart gave a sudden, painful lurch. Inside, nestled amongst a few crumpled tissue papers, lay a single, small object. It was a toy, a pair of bright blue, plastic toy binoculars. For a moment, the musty air seemed to solidify in her lungs. The yellow glow of the bulb seemed to intensify, focusing solely on this one impossible object. She reached in, her hand trembling as she picked them up. They were scuffed, a few scratches marring the plastic, but otherwise intact. Her gaze, blurring with unshed tears, fell to the side where she'd often seen Jacob press his small thumb. And there it was, etched imperfectly but undeniably into the plastic, J.R. Below that, a date, Sep 14, 1989, his 6th birthday, the day she'd given them to him. A wave of dizzying nausea washed over her. This wasn't some random toy. This wasn't a forgotten trinket from her grandmother's childhood. This was Jacob's. The very binoculars he'd been wearing, she remembered with horrifying clarity, the last time she'd seen him alive, tearing around the yard on his 8th birthday. Her mind screamed. How? How could this be here? Why now? The air in the attic, once merely dusty, now felt charged with an unbearable weight, a silent, terrifying question that had just found its voice. Sarah's fingers tightened around the small blue binoculars, the plastic surprisingly warm in her palm. It wasn't just a toy. It was a tangible piece of her past, a fragment of a life violently torn apart, now inexplicably resurfacing. The air, already thick with dust, seemed to press down on her, stealing her breath. She closed her eyes, trying to banish the image, to rationalize it away. It's just a toy, a similar toy, a coincidence. After all these years, how could it be anything else? But her mind, a relentless projector, was already replaying the memory. It was his 6th birthday, 2 years before he vanished. She remembered the sheer delight on his face when he tore open the wrapping paper, his small hands fumbling with the new exciting object. "Wow, Mom! Real binoculars!" he'd shouted, even though they were clearly plastic and meant for play. He'd immediately pressed them to his eyes, scanning their living room as if it were a vast, uncharted wilderness. Later that day, she'd watched him carefully, painstakingly, scratch his initials into the side with a sharp pebble he'd found, an act of ownership that had filled her heart with a quiet tenderness. And the date, September 14th, 1989, etched neatly below. There was no denying it. The JR was unmistakably his, the slightly crooked S and E in September, the trailing 9 in 1989. Details only a mother would remember. A choked sob escaped her throat, raw and ragged. She hadn't cried like this in years, not a true, soul-deep weeping. Her grief had calcified into a dull ache, a constant companion she'd learned to live with. But this was different. This was a reopening of a wound she thought had scarred over, a brutal jolt of hope that threatened to shatter the fragile peace she'd painstakingly built. She sank onto a dusty old trunk, the binoculars clutched to her chest as if they might vanish if she loosened her grip. How could they be here? Jacob had disappeared from their house on the other side of town, not from her grandmother's rambling farmhouse. Her grandmother, bless her soul, had been a meticulous record-keeper, every item labeled, every memory catalogued. Yet this box was unlabeled, tucked away as if forgotten or intentionally hidden. A dizzying array of possibilities, each more agonizing than the last, swirled in her mind. Had Jacob himself, at 8 years old, brought it here that day? Unlikely. The party was at their house. Had her grandmother found it somewhere and, in her declining years, simply put it in a random box? But where would she have found it? And why would she have kept it secret? Her grandmother had known the depth of Sarah's suffering. She would have immediately recognized the binoculars and brought them to her. Unless she couldn't. The thought, chilling and unwelcome, began to solidify. Her grandmother's memory had been fading rapidly in the last few years. There had been moments of confusion, forgotten conversations, misplaced items. Could she have found the binoculars, perhaps even picked them up near the original scene of the disappearance and then, in a fog of dementia, brought them home and tucked them away, later forgetting the entire incident? The idea was almost too painful to bear, implying a decade of wasted time, of a clue lying dormant while Sarah suffered. But what if it wasn't a mistake? What if it was a deliberate act? The unsettling thought surfaced. Had someone else put it here? Someone who knew her grandmother? Someone who knew Jacob? The initial surge of hope, sharp and blinding, began to mix with a bitter cocktail of fear and gnawing suspicion. For 10 years, the police investigations had yielded nothing. No body, no ransom notes, no credible sightings. Just endless, agonizing silence. She'd clung to the slim chance he was alive, even as the world told her to move on, to accept. And now, this, a single, insignificant toy, seemed to scream that her enduring hope might not be a delusion after all. It was a lifeline, thin and frayed, but a lifeline nonetheless. Sarah stood, her legs still shaky, the dust on her jeans an irrelevant detail. The silence of the attic, once oppressive, now felt expectant. This wasn't just a discovery. It was a challenge. A decade of buried grief, of forced resignation, was suddenly overthrown by a single, undeniable truth. Jacob's binoculars were here. And if they were here, then there was a story to be told, a mystery to be unraveled. She looked down at the tiny, worn plastic. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a message. And she, Sarah Reed, was finally ready to listen. The blue binoculars felt impossibly heavy in Sarah's hand as she descended the creaking attic stairs. Each step was a battle against a decade of ingrained resignation, a defiant tremor against the silence that had swallowed her son. She didn't put the binoculars down when she reached the kitchen, instead placing them carefully on the worn pine table, as if they were a fragile, precious artifact from a lost civilization. The late afternoon light filtering through the window illuminated the dust motes still dancing in the air, but now they felt less like reminders of decay and more like tiny, shimmering particles of possibility. Her first instinct was to call the Brookhaven Police Department to demand they reopen Jacob's case, to thrust this improbable miraculous clue into their hands. But a deeper, colder part of her hesitated. She'd spent years interacting with law enforcement, first with desperate hope, then with dwindling patience, and finally with a profound, weary sense of futility. She remembered the official pronouncements, the sympathetic but firm shakes of heads, the careful use of past tense when referring to Jacob. They had done their jobs, she knew. They had exhausted every lead, interviewed every witness, combed every inch of terrain. But they had found nothing. And now, 10 years later, what would a plastic toy mean to them? A trinket, easily lost, easily passed on. A mother's desperate fantasy. No, she needed to start with someone who understood, someone who had seen her pain firsthand, someone who had believed in her once. Captain Mark Thompson. He had been the lead detective on Jacob's case, a man with tired eyes but a relentless dedication that had, for a time, kept her clinging to hope. He had retired 5 years ago, leaving the force for a quieter life, a life Sarah had often envied from afar. She found his number in an old dog-eared address book, her finger tracing the faded ink. It rang twice before a gruff, familiar voice answered. "Thompson here." "Mark, it's Sarah Reed." A beat of silence stretched, heavy with unspoken history. "Sarah, goodness, it's been a while. How are you?" His voice softened, a genuine weariness underlying the polite inquiry. I think I found something, Mark." Her voice trembled despite her best efforts to steady it. "It's Jacob's. His blue binoculars. The ones I gave him for his 6th birthday. They're here, in my grandmother's attic." Another, longer silence. Sarah could almost picture him, rubbing the back of his neck, the same gesture he used when he was weighing a difficult piece of evidence. "Sarah, I understand this is incredibly difficult. After all this time, finding something like that, it's natural to feel." "No, Mark, don't tell me it's natural. Don't tell me it's probably nothing. This is his, the initials, the date. It's him." Her voice rose, betraying the fragile control she tried to maintain. "How could it be there? He disappeared from our house. Grandma lived across town. How could it have gotten there?" He cleared his throat. "Sarah, listen. I know this is painful, truly, but items like that, especially small toys, can get lost. They can be picked up, sold at a yard sale, even decades later. Your grandmother, with her memory issues later on, perhaps she found it somewhere and, not fully understanding, just put it away. It happens." His words, delivered with a professional, sympathetic tone, were a cold splash of reality. He was right. It could be nothing. Another dead end. Another flicker of hope extinguished, leaving her in deeper darkness than before. But something inside her, a stubborn, primal certainty, refused to accept it. This wasn't just a toy. This was Jacob's toy, found in a place that held no logical connection to his disappearance. The very improbability of it was what screamed its significance. "I need your help, Mark," she said, her voice firmer now, infused with a new, quiet resolve. "Even if the department won't officially reopen the case, I need you to help me. Just talk to me. Tell me what I should do. Where do I even begin?" He sighed, a long, drawn-out sound that spoke of past burdens. "Sarah, you know I'm retired. I can't officially do anything." "I know," she interjected quickly. "But you know the case. You know the town. You know what to look for." Another pause. "Okay," he finally said, his voice a little less weary, a spark of the old detective rekindling. "Let's talk. Come by my place tomorrow morning. We can go over everything you remember from that day, every little detail. And then we'll talk about this toy. But Sarah," his tone grew serious, a warning edge to it. "Don't get your hopes up too high. 10 years is a long time." She hung up, a strange mix of exhilaration and dread coursing through her veins. He was right to caution her. But for the first time in a decade, Sarah felt a stirring, a faint flicker of purpose beyond merely existing. If the police wouldn't look, she would. If the world had forgotten Jacob, she never would. She would start with the people who were there, the friends and family who had gathered for his birthday, and anyone who might have had contact with her grandmother around that time. The dusty attic had offered up a ghost, and Sarah Reed, broken but not yet shattered, was ready to chase it. The morning sun, usually a cheerful presence in Brookhaven, felt sharp and intrusive as Sarah drove towards the home of Mrs. Henderson, their former next-door neighbor. 10 years had passed, but the memories of that day, sharp as shards of glass, still cut her. Mrs. Henderson, a sweet, somewhat frail woman in her late 70s, had been a fixture of their street, always tending her rose bushes, always with a kind word and a fresh-baked cookie for Jacob. Sarah hoped she wouldn't stir up too much pain for her. Mrs. Henderson greeted her at the door, her eyes widening in recognition. "Sarah, my dear, it's been far too long. Please, come in, come in." Her voice was soft, laced with the gentle cadence of the South, a charming anomaly in coastal Maine. Inside, the house smelled of potpourri and old lace, a comforting scent that reminded Sarah of happier times. They sat in the sunlit living room, and after a few polite pleasantries about the weather and Mrs. Henderson's health, Sarah carefully broached the subject. She pulled the blue binoculars from her bag, placing them on the coffee table between them. Mrs. Henderson's gaze softened immediately, a distant sadness clouding her eyes. Oh, Jacob's binoculars. He loved those so. He was always exploring the backyard with them, pretending to be a great adventurer. I remember him clambering over your fence, always with those glued to his face. She chuckled, a fragile sound. Then her smile faded. It was such a terrible day, dear, such a terrible day. Sarah leaned forward, her voice hushed. "Mrs. Henderson, do you remember anything about them? After that day, I mean. Did you ever see them again?" The older woman frowned, her brow furrowing in concentration. No, I don't think so. It was all so chaotic, wasn't it? The police, the sirens. A blur. She sighed. But I do remember him with them that day, yes. He was so proud. He'd even shown me how he'd scratched his initials into the side. A clever boy. Sarah's heart twisted. The confirmation, though painful, solidified her conviction. My grandmother, she had them. I found them in her attic. Mrs. Henderson's eyes widened slightly. Your grandmother, dear Eleanor, that's odd. She rarely came over to your house, not in those last few years, and after her memory started to go, she trailed off, a look of genuine confusion on her face. She was a wonderful woman, but towards the end, she'd mix things up. She'd put the sugar in the salt shaker, or tell the same story 3 times in a row. It was heartbreaking to watch. Sarah nodded, a knot forming in her stomach. This confirmed her earlier suspicion. Her grandmother's declining cognitive state could explain the binoculars' presence, but it still didn't explain how they got there. It merely added another layer to the enigma. Her next stop was an old friend of David's, a man named Jeremy Clark. Jeremy and his family had moved to California years ago, leaving Brookhaven behind for brighter prospects, but they still kept in touch sporadically. David, Jacob's father, had never fully recovered from the loss and had moved away from Brookhaven himself after a few years, unable to bear the constant reminders. Sarah hadn't seen Jeremy in at least 5 years, but she knew he'd been at the party. She managed to track him down through a mutual acquaintance and arranged a phone call. The familiar sound of his voice, slightly deeper now, brought back a flood of memories. After the initial awkwardness and expressions of sympathy, Sarah guided the conversation to that fateful day. "Jeremy," she began, her voice carefully neutral. "Do you remember anything unusual from Jacob's birthday party? Anything at all, no matter how small?" He paused, a distant rustling sound indicating he was probably pacing. Unusual. Well, aside from the obvious nightmare, you mean? Gosh, Sarah, it was such a blur of panic. We were all just searching. He thought for a moment. Actually, now that you mention it, there was something, though I never thought anything of it at the time. Probably just some weird coincidence. Sarah held her breath, her grip tightening on the phone. What was it, Jeremy? I remember seeing a strange car parked down the street, a few houses away. It was an older model, a beat-up sedan, kinda faded green, and there was a man sitting in it. He wasn't one of the parents, I knew all of them. He was just sitting there, watching the party. Did you see his face? Sarah pressed, her heart beginning to pound. Not clearly, no, just a glimpse. He was older, I think, maybe in his 50s, kinda scruffy looking if I remember correctly. I just thought, maybe he was waiting for someone, or lost. It's a quiet street, but not completely isolated. Didn't think anything of it until everything happened. Did you tell the police? I don't think so, Jeremy admitted, a note of regret in his voice. I just thought it was irrelevant. So many cars parked, so many people coming and going. It seemed like nothing. Why? Does it mean something? Sarah's mind raced. A strange man, an old, beat-up car, watching the party. And Jacob's binoculars turning up years later, hidden on her grandmother's attic. The pieces didn't fit, not yet, but they were no longer completely random. The silence of 10 years was beginning to crack, and through the fissures, Sarah could almost hear the faint, chilling echo of a forgotten truth. The meeting with Mark Thompson had been a whirlwind of painful recollection and cautious strategy. He listened patiently, his retired detective's mind clearly sifting through every detail, every tremor in her voice. He still maintained his professional skepticism, but the faint spark of interest in his eyes when she recounted Jeremy's story about the green sedan and the strange man gave her a fragile thread of hope. It's a long shot, Sarah, he'd warned, but sometimes the smallest details are the ones that finally break a case. He advised her to keep digging into her grandmother's past, into anything that might connect her to that specific day. Back at her grandmother's farmhouse, Sarah found herself drawn back to the attic. The air, though still heavy with the scent of age, no longer felt oppressive. It hummed with a new kind of energy, a quiet urgency. She was no longer simply clearing out a house, she was searching for answers. This time, her eyes scanned for anything that might have belonged to her grandmother from that specific period, anything that might shed light on how Jacob's binoculars ended up here. She found a dusty, leather-bound photo album tucked away on a high shelf, nestled between a stack of antique novels and a collection of her grandmother's gardening journals. Its cover was embossed with a faded gold design, and a faint scent of potpourri still clung to its pages. It was her grandmother's primary photo album, a chronological record of family events. Sarah had seen it countless times as a child, flipping through pages of Christmases, summer picnics, and awkward school portraits. Now, she opened it with a new, desperate focus. She thumbed through the pages, her heart a drumbeat against her ribs. There were photos of her own childhood, of her parents, of David, and then there they were, the pages dedicated to Jacob. His first steps, his kindergarten graduation, his gap-toothed grins after losing his first tooth. Each image was a tender ache. She turned a page, and then another, her breath catching in her throat. These were from his 8th birthday party, the day he vanished. The quality of the photos was typical for 1991. Slightly grainy, some faces caught mid-laughter, others blurred in motion. There was Jacob, blowing out candles on a brightly frosted cake, his face smeared with icing. There he was, chasing a balloon across the lawn, his red baseball cap nearly falling off. And there, unmistakable, bright blue against his yellow t-shirt were the binoculars hanging around his neck. On one particular photo, taken from a slightly higher angle, possibly from the porch, Jacob was mid-stride, racing towards the swing set. The binoculars were clearly visible, catching a glint of sunlight. Sarah's gaze, however, was drawn beyond Jacob, to the very edge of the frame, partially obscured by a towering lilac bush at the property line. A dark shape. She squinted, leaning closer, her fingers tracing the faded image. It was a vehicle. A car. Old, with a faded green hue that was difficult to discern clearly in the low light of the attic, but there. And next to it, a figure. He was standing, leaning against the car, his back mostly to the camera. He was tall, his posture slightly stooped. His hair, what little she could see, seemed sparse and light. He wasn't looking at the party. He was looking towards the house, or perhaps towards the edge of the yard where Jacob had been playing just moments before the photo was taken. His arm was raised slightly, as if he were adjusting something on his shoulder or reaching for something on the car. It was the man Jeremy had described, the strange man in the faded green sedan, the one who had been watching. A shiver, cold and bone-deep, traced its way up Sarah's spine. It wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. The binoculars, the car, the man. They were all threads, weaving into a pattern she was only just beginning to perceive. This wasn't a random item lost and found. This was a direct, chilling connection. Her grandmother, with her fading memory, might have unknowingly held a piece of this puzzle. And the man in the photo, he was no longer just a vague detail from Jeremy's memory. He was a face, or at least a silhouette, burned into a single, blurry photograph. The mystery surrounding Jacob's disappearance, once a vast, empty chasm, was now gaining edges, outlines, a terrifying shape in the shadows. The old photo album, with its chilling, blurry glimpse of a stranger, lay open on Mark Thompson's coffee table. His small, cluttered living room, usually a haven of quiet retirement, felt charged with an almost tangible tension. Sarah watched his face intently as he studied the photograph, his brow furrowed in the same concentrated frown she remembered from a decade ago. He picked up a magnifying glass, a tool from his old investigative days, and scrutinized the faint image of the car and the figure. "It's difficult to make out clear details," he murmured, his voice low, almost to himself. "The angle, the light. It's just a silhouette, really." He straightened up, setting the magnifying glass down with a soft click. "But I'll give you this, Sarah. It aligns with Jeremy's description. An older, beat-up car, a male figure, and parked slightly away from the main activity." A fragile spark of validation ignited within Sarah. So, it is something, then. It's not just my imagination? Mark leaned back in his armchair, a sigh escaping him. "It's a lead, Sarah. A new piece of information we didn't have before. And after all these years, that's significant. But we need to be careful. Let's think logically." He paused, rubbing his temples. "Consider this. Brookhaven, even in '91, wasn't exactly bustling. But it wasn't a ghost town either. A random car, a random person in it. It's not unheard of. Maybe a delivery driver on a break, a tourist lost, or even just someone pulled over to make a phone call." Sarah felt a familiar cold dread begin to creep in, threatening to extinguish the fragile flame of hope she carried. He was stating facts, rational possibilities, the kind of logic that had always ultimately led to the official conclusion of no new leads. "And the binoculars," Mark continued, his gaze drifting to the blue plastic toy Sarah still clutched in her lap. "Let's consider that, too. If this man did have something to do with Jacob's disappearance, why would he leave the binoculars, let alone at your grandmother's house? That doesn't fit the profile of a typical abductor. If he took Jacob, he'd want to be as clean as possible, leave no trace." He paused, collecting his thoughts. Unless he was a good Samaritan, as you hinted at. Someone who saw Jacob wandering off, perhaps in a moment of confusion or play, and took him. Maybe they intended to return him, but circumstances prevented it. Or they might have been someone with some kind of mental health issue, a skewed sense of reality, who genuinely believed they were helping the child. In that scenario, the binoculars could have been dropped, or maybe even left behind by the man inadvertently, or perhaps even intentionally by Jacob himself as a desperate, childish clue. Sarah listened, her mind reeling. The idea of a Good Samaritan gone wrong, or someone suffering from a mental illness, was less monstrous than a calculating abductor, but still terrifying. It lent a strange, disquieting plausibility to the binoculars' presence. A Good Samaritan, or a stranger with a broken mind? Or, Mark added, seeing the distress on her face, it could simply be that the binoculars were dropped near your house that day, found by someone later, perhaps picked up by your grandmother during one of her walks when she was still lucid, and then, as her memory declined, placed in a random box. Or maybe someone else found them and, having no idea who they belonged to, sold them at a yard sale, and your grandmother, in her confusion, bought them without realizing. He shrugged, a gesture of quiet resignation. It's a long shot, Sarah. A very long shot to connect them directly to Jacob's disappearance after all this time. His words, though delivered with a genuine attempt at kindness, felt like a heavy weight pressing down on her. He was trying to protect her from false hope, from another decade of agonizing pursuit. And part of her, the weary, rational part, knew he was right. These were all logical, mundane explanations for an impossible discovery. But another part, a fierce, almost intuitive certainty that had been dormant for 10 years, refused to yield. It was a visceral conviction, burning bright despite the logic. No, it wasn't a random object. It wasn't just a dropped toy, found and misplaced. The way it was tucked away, almost hidden, the way her grandmother had never mentioned it. It felt deliberate. And the man in the car, he wasn't just a passerby. The cold, unyielding grip of intuition told her that the binoculars were not lost. They were left. A breadcrumb. A message. I don't believe it was an accident, Mark, Sarah said, her voice quiet but firm, startling herself with its conviction. My grandmother, even with her memory failing, had a system, and this wasn't part of it. This was different, and that man, he was watching. I don't know why, but I feel it. This isn't a coincidence. This is a clue, and I'm going to find out what it means. Mark Thompson looked at her, his tired eyes searching hers. He saw not just a grieving mother, but a woman possessed by a new, almost frightening determination. He had known Sarah Reed for 20 years, and he knew that look. "Okay, Sarah," he said, a flicker of grudging admiration in his voice. "If you're going to pursue this, you need to be smart. Start with what you know, this photo, the timing. Your grandmother's last years, and that car, an old faded green sedan. It's not much, but it's more than nothing." He nodded slowly. "I'll do what I can from my end, discreetly, but this is your journey now." As Sarah left his house, the doubts Mark had presented still echoed in her mind, a discordant melody. Yet, beneath them, a fierce, almost triumphant resolve was growing. She no longer merely hoped Jacob was alive. She felt an undeniable magnetic pull towards a truth she was beginning to believe had been hidden in plain sight. The binoculars were not just a memento. They were a breadcrumb, and she was finally following the trail. The photograph, magnified and slightly grainy, lay spread across Sarah's kitchen table alongside a topographical map of Brookhaven and its surrounding areas. She'd spent the last 2 days immersed in her grandmother's old journals, searching for any mention of the faded green sedan, any hint of a stranger, or any recurring place names. Her grandmother, Eleanor, had been a diligent record-keeper, but her later entries were a jumble of fading memories and fragmented thoughts, like a once clear stream muddied by a relentless current. Still, amidst the rambling notes about gardening and church bake sales, Sarah found a recurring theme: the old Miller farm. Eleanor often scribbled phrases like, "Must remember to check on the Miller place," or "Worried about the old road to the Miller farm." In her more lucid moments, her grandmother had occasionally mentioned the Miller family, distant cousins who had left Brookhaven decades ago, leaving their ancestral farm to fall into disrepair. It was a place Sarah vaguely remembered from her childhood as a forbidden, slightly eerie landmark on the edge of town, whispered about by kids as haunted. Mark Thompson, when she'd called him with this new focus, had agreed it was worth investigating. Eleanor had a strong sense of duty, he'd said. Even as her memory faded, old habits would cling. If she kept mentioning that farm, there might be a reason. He'd done a quick background check. The Miller farm had been mostly abandoned since the 1970s, with a few absentee owners over the years, none of whom seemed to have done anything with it. Armed with a faded map from her grandmother's desk and a compass, Sarah set out. The short drive from Brookhaven's charming Main Street quickly gave way to narrower, unpaved roads. The well-manicured lawns and white picket fences vanished, replaced by overgrown fields and dense, whispering woods. The air grew cooler, shadowed by the towering pines that lined the winding dirt track. Dust devils spun in her rearview mirror as her old sedan bumped and swayed over potholes. The road became steadily worse, the trees pressing in closer, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. Signs of civilization dwindled. No power lines, no mailboxes, just the relentless, unyielding wilderness. A prickle of unease, distinct from her usual grief, began to prickle at her skin. This was truly the edge of everything familiar. Finally, the trees thinned, revealing a clearing, and there it was. The Miller farm. It was a desolate, mournful sight. The main farmhouse, once a proud, sturdy structure, now stood as a decaying monument to forgotten lives. Its clapboard siding was peeling, revealing raw, weathered wood beneath. Most of the windows were broken, jagged teeth in gaping holes reflecting the gray sky like vacant eyes. The porch roof sagged precariously, threatening to collapse at any moment. Overgrown vines, thick as anaconda coils, strangled what remained of the porch railing and climbed aggressively up the walls, attempting to reclaim the house for nature. A rusted, skeletal windmill stood guard over what had once been a vast cornfield, its blades missing or twisted into grotesque shapes. A dilapidated barn. Its massive wooden doors, hanging ajar, seemed to slump wearily into itself. Its roof a patchwork of missing shingles and moss. The air here was still, heavy, imbued with the scent of damp earth and decay. It felt utterly abandoned, steeped in a profound, unsettling silence. As Sarah parked her car on the overgrown dirt track leading to the farmhouse, a flicker of movement caught her eye near the barn. A startled crow took flight, its raucous caw echoing through the silence, making her jump. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This place felt wrong. Not just neglected, but imbued with a sense of lingering sorrow. A forgotten story waiting to be told. She glanced down at the binoculars in her passenger seat, then back at the ominous silhouette of the barn. If there was a clue here, it was buried deep in the shadows, waiting to be unearthed. And Sarah, her resolve hardening despite the prickle of fear, knew she had to find it. The crow's caw faded into the vast, heavy silence of the Miller farm. Sarah stood by her car, the wind whipping strands of hair across her face, her gaze fixed on the dilapidated barn. It was the largest outbuilding, hulking in the afternoon light, its weathered timbers a testament to years of neglect. The main farmhouse, for all its crumbling grandeur, felt too exposed, too empty. The barn, with its gaping shadowed maw, seemed to draw her in, whispering of secrets. A faint scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic and vaguely unsettling, hung in the air round the barn. She hesitated, her hand instinctively reaching for the pocket where she'd tucked her phone. Calling Mark now, before she had anything concrete, felt premature. She needed to know. She needed to see. Taking a deep breath, Sarah pushed aside the fear that clawed at her throat and walked towards the barn. The ground was uneven, choked with tall, brittle weeds that crunched under her boots. As she approached, the immense wooden doors, hanging loose on rusted hinges, creaked faintly in the breeze like a slow, painful breath. One door was partially ajar, revealing a sliver of darkness within. She pushed the door open further, its groan echoing through the vast, empty space. A wave of colder, heavier air met her. The interior was a cavernous expanse, filled with the ghosts of forgotten harvests and livestock. Motes of dust, thicker than ever, danced in the weak shafts of light that pierced through gaps in the roof. Old farm equipment, rusted and broken, lay scattered like forgotten bones. Cobwebs, thick and iridescent, hung like ancient tapestries from the rafters. But then, as her eyes adjusted, Sarah noticed something that froze the blood in her veins. In a far corner, partially shielded by a pile of rotting hay bales, there was a makeshift structure. Not a part of the barn itself, but something added. A small, rough shelter, crudely fashioned from salvaged wood planks and old tarpaulins. It wasn't large, barely big enough for one person to sleep in. A cold certainty settled in Sarah's stomach. Someone had been living here. Recently. She moved closer, each step deliberate, her heart hammering against her ribs. The air around the shelter was subtly different, less stale, with a faint, lingering human smell. As she peered inside, the weak light revealed a flattened area on the dusty floor, as if someone had slept there. A few discarded food wrappers, surprisingly fresh, lay near what looked like a makeshift fire pit, small and contained. Then her gaze fell upon the wall of the shelter. Nailed to the rough planks or tucked into cracks were several pieces of paper, child's drawings. Sarah gasped, a sound lost in the vastness of the barn. Her hand flew to her mouth, stifling a sob. The drawings were simple, crayon on faded paper, but undeniably childlike. A stick figure family, a lopsided house with a smoking chimney, and then a drawing that stole her breath completely. It was a crude depiction of a boy. He had a shock of messy brown hair, just like Jacob's. Around his neck, unmistakable in its bright blue color, was a drawing of a pair of binoculars. And standing next to him, a tall, shadowy figure with broad shoulders and thin lines for hair. The same silhouette she'd seen in her grandmother's photograph. Below them, a hastily scrawled line that looked like the wavy lines of water, and then a series of simple, blocky letters. She knelt down, her eyes stinging, trying to decipher them. Beer, O-O-K-H-A-V-E-N. It was Jacob's hand, the same slightly uneven, eager strokes he'd used when learning to write his name. The same slightly oversized head on the stick figures. It was him, and he had been here. He was alive. Her mind raced, a whirlwind of exhilarating terror and dizzying hope. If Jacob had been here drawing these pictures, then he wasn't just a ghost of the past. He was a survivor, and the man with him, he wasn't just a fleeting shadow in an old photo. He was real. He had been with Jacob. Frantically, Sarah scanned the rest of the makeshift dwelling. Tucked into a crevice in the wall, she found a small, whittled wooden bird. Crudely carved, but with surprising detail, its wings spread as if in flight. Jacob had always loved carving small wooden figures with his father's old pocket knife. This was his. No doubt. A desperate cry tore from her throat, a sound she hadn't realized she was holding back. This wasn't a mistaken identity or a random coincidence. This was Jacob. This was proof. And the truth, hidden for a decade in the dusty corners of an abandoned farm, was finally beginning to emerge. She pulled out her phone, her fingers fumbling, and dialed Mark Thompson's number, her voice a raw, desperate whisper. "Mark, you have to come. I found him. Or at least, I found traces of him. He was here." The weight of a forgotten story, long buried, was finally too heavy to bear alone. The distant wail of sirens, faint at first, then growing steadily louder, ripped through the profound silence of the Miller farm. Sarah stood rigidly by the makeshift shelter in the barn, the hand-drawn binoculars still clutched in her trembling fingers, the cold plastic a grounding presence. She had called Mark Thompson, her voice a raw, desperate whisper. He, in turn, had called the Brookhaven police, cutting through the usual red tape with the authority of a seasoned, albeit retired, officer. He had understood the gravity of her discovery instantly. Within 20 minutes, 2 patrol cars, their lights flashing silently, kicked up plumes of dust as they roared down the overgrown track. Following close behind was Mark Thompson's unassuming sedan. Officers, grim-faced and professional, fanned out, securing the perimeter, their movements sharp against the decaying backdrop of the farm. Detective Harding, a younger officer Sarah vaguely knew, approached her first, his expression a mix of caution and disbelief. "Ms. Reed," he began, his voice surprisingly gentle given the circumstances, "Captain Thompson said you found something." Sarah simply pointed, unable to speak, towards the crude shelter. Mark, his face etched with attention Sarah rarely saw, walked directly to it, his eyes scanning every detail. He saw the flattened sleeping area, the food wrappers, the small, crude fire pit. Then his gaze landed on the drawings. He leaned in, his breath catching as he spotted the blue binoculars drawn on the boy's neck, the distinctive J.R. initials scrawled beneath the figure, and the word Brookhaven. "Get forensics in here," Mark ordered Harding, his voice low and urgent. "And a full search of the barn, then the entire property. Look for anything at all, that might give us a clue to who was living here, or where they might have gone." The barn, once silent and empty, now bustled with activity. Officers in uniform moved systematically, their flashlights cutting through the shadows. Crime scene technicians clad in white suits began meticulously documenting and collecting evidence, their quiet, methodical movements a stark contrast to the urgency of Sarah's emotions. As they examined the crude shelter, one of the officers, a younger man with sharp eyes, noticed a section of the back wall that seemed slightly off. The wood planks there were newer, less weathered than the rest. He tapped it. It sounded hollow. "Captain, detective," he called out, his voice hushed but excited. "Look here." Mark and Harding immediately joined him. With careful effort, they managed to pry one of the planks loose, revealing a narrow, hidden cavity. It was a crude, small space, smelling faintly of stale air and something metallic. Inside, nestled among a few tattered blankets, were more items. A tattered, well-worn children's book of fairy tales, its spine broken, its pages dog-eared. A small, carefully folded piece of fabric that looked like a faded piece of an old baseball cap. And, tucked beneath it all, a small, worn leather wallet. Mark carefully opened the wallet. Inside, a faded driver's license. The name, Silas Blackwood. The address, a long-abandoned property in a neighboring county, known for its extreme isolation. The photo on the license showed a man in his late 50s or early 60s, his face gaunt, his hair thin and receding. Sarah gasped. It was the man from the photograph, the silhouette by the green sedan. "Silas Blackwood," Mark murmured, his voice grim. He was a recluse, lived alone for decades, had a history of eccentric behavior, though nothing violent. A few minor run-ins with the law for trespassing on deserted properties, always claiming he was looking for something lost. His family tried to get him help over the years, but he always refused. Last anyone heard, he'd just vanished a few years ago. Thought he'd just succumbed to the elements out there. Detective Harding, his eyes wide with comprehension, looked at Sarah. "Ms. Reed, it sounds like Mr. Blackwood may have been suffering from a severe form of dementia or a similar psychiatric condition. He might have seen Jacob, a small child wandering slightly away from the party, perhaps looking for a lost ball or exploring, and in his altered state, genuinely believed the boy needed saving from some perceived danger, or that Jacob was someone else entirely. A lost grandchild, perhaps. The binoculars. He might have found them, or Jacob might have still had them around his neck when Silas took him. He might have kept them as a cherished item, or perhaps Jacob left them there as a way to send a message. The implication hit Sarah with the force of a physical blow. Not a monster, not a predator in the traditional sense, but a deeply unwell, lonely man. It didn't lessen the horror of the abduction, but it shifted its terrifying nature. Her son had been living in a shadow world, not one of malicious intent, but of profound mental illness and isolation. He hadn't been killed. He'd been rehomed unintentionally. The fairy tale book. Jacob had loved those stories. He'd carried one everywhere. She snatched it from the technician's gloved hand. As she opened the worn cover, a small, folded piece of paper, barely larger than a postage stamp, slipped out. It was a crude map, drawn with a crayon leading from the approximate location of the farm. And at the bottom, in hesitant, slightly wobbly block letters, clearly Jacob's hand, were 2 words. Light home. A lighthouse. Jacob had always loved the old lighthouse at Cape Harbor, just a few miles down the coast from Brookhaven. Her grandmother had taken him there countless times. It was their special place. A powerful, undeniable wave of certainty washed over Sarah. He was alive. He had to be. And he was trying to tell her where he was. The barn at the Miller farm, once a tomb of forgotten memories, was now a buzzing hive of forensic activity. The blue binoculars and the drawings were carefully packaged, the crude wooden bird handled with delicate gloved hands, but it was the tattered fairy tale book and the small folded note that held Sarah's entire world suspended. Detective Harding, his face a mask of professional intensity, carefully retrieved the note from Sarah's trembling hand, placing it into an evidence bag. "We'll need to send this to the lab for handwriting analysis, Ms. Reed," he stated, his voice calm but firm. "It's standard procedure." "But it's his," Sarah insisted, her voice raw. "I know his writing. That's Jacob's J, his K. I know it." She wanted to snatch it back, to clutch it to her chest, but she knew the rules. This was no longer just her desperate search. It was an official investigation, reignited. Mark Thompson, observing from a slight distance, stepped forward. "Harding, prioritize this, and get a team ready to follow up on any potential leads from Silas Blackwood's last known whereabouts, his family, anyone who might have seen him with a child." The next few hours were an agonizing blur of waiting and forced patience. Sarah sat in Mark's sedan, wrapped in a blanket an officer had given her, watching the methodical work unfold. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in hues of orange and purple, but its beauty was lost on her. Her entire being was focused on the fragile thread of hope that had just appeared. Finally, just as twilight deepened into true night, Harding returned to Mark's car, his face unreadable. He tapped on the window, and Mark lowered it. "Captain, Ms. Reed," Harding said, his voice flat. "The preliminary handwriting analysis is in. The script on the note, given the developmental stage it represents, is highly consistent with the child's handwriting from that period." He paused, then continued, his voice gaining a note of quiet awe. "And, comparing it to samples from Jacob Reed's schoolwork provided by the original case file, the match is strong. Very strong, Ms. Reed. It's Jacob." Sarah let out a choked cry, tears finally streaming down her face, not of sorrow but of an overwhelming, soul-shattering relief. He was alive. After 10 years of believing she was shouting into a void, her voice had found an echo. "And the message?" Mark prompted, his own voice tight with emotion. Harding carefully pulled out the evidence bag with the small note. The full message reads, "I am okay. I miss Mom." And below that, Captain, Ms. Reed, there's a crude drawing, a series of wavy lines, and above it a small triangular shape with a light on top. And the words "light" and "home" are scrawled underneath. Our mapping unit has cross-referenced it with local landmarks. It appears to be a drawing of the old Cape Harbor lighthouse. Sarah's breath hitched. The Cape Harbor lighthouse. Her grandmother used to take Jacob there almost every Sunday. It was their ritual, their secret hideaway from the world. They would climb to the very top, Jacob clutching his binoculars, pretending to be a sailor scanning the horizon. It was a place of comfort, of wonder, of cherished memories. He had been trying to send her a message for years to the only place he knew she would understand. The significance of the word home on the note, coupled with the drawing of their special place, solidified her conviction. He was there. He had to be. "That's it," Sarah whispered, her voice hoarse but filled with a new, fierce strength. "The Cape Harbor Lighthouse. That's where he'll be. It's our place. My grandmother always took him there. He knows I'd understand." Mark looked at Harding, then back at Sarah, a flicker of profound understanding in his eyes. The pieces of the puzzle, once scattered and seemingly unrelated, were finally clicking into place, guided by a mother's unwavering love and a child's desperate plea. "All right, Harding," Mark said, his voice crisp, taking charge. "Get a unit to the Cape Harbor Lighthouse. Move fast, but be careful. We don't know the full situation or if Silas Blackwood is still with him. Sarah, you're coming with us." As the police vehicle spun around, sirens now blaring, piercing the quiet night, Sarah felt a surge of energy she hadn't known she possessed. 10 years of emptiness, 10 years of silent screams were about to end. The long, dark road of grief had led her to a flickering beacon of hope, and she would follow it, no matter the cost, to bring her son home. The police cruiser sliced through the inky blackness of the coastal road, its sirens wailing a desperate song into the night. Sarah sat in the back, sandwiched between Mark Thompson and a uniformed officer, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles ached. Every turn, every dip in the road felt agonizingly slow. The scent of salt and pine filled the air, a familiar aroma that usually brought peace but now only amplified the frantic beat of her heart. "How much longer?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the siren's shriek. "Just a few minutes, Sarah," Mark replied, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "The lighthouse is just around this bend." Then, through the darkness, a distant beam of light cut through the night, sweeping across the rugged coastline. The Cape Harbor Lighthouse. A beacon of hope, just as Jacob's drawing had promised. The cruiser skidded to a halt on the gravel path leading to the lighthouse, followed closely by 2 more police vehicles. Officers, moving with a disciplined urgency, fanned out, flashlights cutting through the gloom. The old lighthouse, a stoic sentinel against the raging sea for over a century, loomed above them, its lamp casting its rhythmic, comforting sweep. "Approach cautiously," Detective Harding's voice crackled over a radio. "We don't know if Blackwood is armed or his current state." Sarah paid them no mind. Her eyes were fixed on the lighthouse door. Mark, sensing her desperation, placed a reassuring hand on her arm. "Stay close to me, Sarah." They moved as a silent unit, their boots crunching on the gravel. The lighthouse door, thick and weathered, stood ajar. A faint, almost imperceptible light flickered from within. Mark nudged it open further. The air inside was cold, damp, and smelled of salt, old stone, and something vaguely human. The spiral staircase, winding its way up into the darkness, seemed endless. They ascended slowly, flashlights sweeping the rough-hewn walls, the only sounds their strained breathing and the distant crash of waves against the rocks. As they neared the top, a faint rhythmic sound became audible, a low, raspy humming, and then a child's voice, reading. It was indistinct at first, then clearer. And the giant's heart grew 3 sizes that day. Sarah froze. It was The Grinch, Jacob's favorite story. They reached the final landing, a small circular room at the base of the lamp house. And there they were. Silas Blackwood sat huddled on a worn blanket in a corner, his back against the cold stone wall. He was thin, his clothes grimy, his white hair disheveled. In his lap, he held the very fairy tale book Sarah had seen in the barn. His eyes, though unfocused and distant, were fixed on the boy curled up beside him, a young man now, perhaps 18 or 19, his face gaunt, his limbs long and gangly. Jacob. He was thinner than she remembered, his clothes too large, patched in places. His hair, once a neat brown, was long and tangled. His face was marked by years of sun and solitude, his eyes wide and wary, but unmistakably his. He was reading aloud from the book, his voice surprisingly steady, a quiet comfort for the old man. "Jacob!" Sarah screamed, the name tearing from her throat, raw and desperate. Both heads snapped up. Silas Blackwood's eyes widened, a flicker of fear crossing their hazy depths. Jacob's gaze, at first startled, then filled with an unimaginable disbelief, met hers across the small room. A spark, a recognition, flared between them, cutting through a decade of separation. "Mom?" Jacob whispered, the single word hoarse, fragile, almost foreign on his tongue. The officers moved quickly, professionally. "Silas Blackwood, you're under arrest," Detective Harding stated, his voice firm but not unkind. The old man offered no resistance, simply looking confused, his hands still clutching the book. He seemed to shrink into himself, murmuring indistinctly about a lost boy and keeping him safe. Sarah ignored them all. She broke free from Mark's grasp, stumbling forward, her arms outstretched. "Jacob, my baby. Oh my God, Jacob!" Jacob, still hesitant, slowly unfolded himself from the corner. He looked at her, his eyes searching as if trying to reconcile the woman before him with the blurred memory of a mother. He was taller, his face sharper, but the curve of his cheek, the slight tilt of his head, was still her son. "Mom," he whispered again, a tear tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. "You found me." And then she was on him, wrapping him in an embrace she'd dreamt of for 10 agonizing years. She buried her face in his shoulder, inhaling the strange, unfamiliar scent of him, mingled with the faint smell of salt and cold stone. Her tears, hot and torrential, soaked into his worn shirt. He was stiff at first, almost wary, but then, slowly, tentatively, his arms rose, closing around her, a raw, fragile warmth returning to her world. "I knew," she sobbed, pulling back to look at him through blurry eyes. "I always knew you were alive. I never gave up." He looked at her, his eyes still wide with a mix of fear and something akin to wonder. He said the world was gone, that everyone was gone. He said I was his grandson, that I had to stay with him, that it wasn't safe. His voice was thin but full of a child's lingering confusion. He built a safe place. He read me stories. But I always missed you. Sarah clutched him tighter, pressing kisses to his hair, his forehead. "It's all over now, sweetheart. You're safe. You're home." The light from the lighthouse lamp swung around, illuminating their tear-stained faces, two souls reunited in the vast echoing chamber, the culmination of a decade of unimaginable pain and an unwavering, relentless mother's love. The first few weeks after Jacob's return were a fragile dance of rediscovery. The small cottage, once silent and mournful, was now filled with hesitant conversations, the clatter of plates and the comforting, if sometimes awkward, presence of a son who was both a stranger and the most familiar person in her world. Jacob was physically safe, but the years with Silas Blackwood had left indelible marks. He was quiet, wary, still prone to looking over his shoulder as if expecting unseen dangers. His understanding of the world was skewed by Silas's delusions, a bizarre narrative of an apocalyptic event that had wiped out everyone but them. Therapists, specializing in child trauma and long-term separation, became regular fixtures in their lives. Dr. Evans, a kind-faced woman with gentle eyes, patiently helped Jacob navigate the labyrinth of his own memories, gently untangling truth from the elaborate fictions woven by Silas. He learned that the zombies were merely figments of a sick mind, that the world hadn't ended, and that his mother had indeed been searching for him every single day. The process was slow, marked by breakthroughs and setbacks, by moments of frustration and glimmers of the boy Jacob used to be. Sarah sat in on every session, a silent, unwavering pillar of support, her hand always ready to take his. Silas Blackwood was taken into custody, then transferred to a specialized medical facility. The police investigation confirmed what Mark Thompson and Sarah had suspected. Silas had indeed been suffering from severe, undiagnosed frontotemporal dementia, a cruel disease that ravaged his mind, replacing reality with delusions. He genuinely believed Jacob was his long-lost grandson, lost in a catastrophe only he could see. He hadn't meant to harm Jacob. He had simply been protecting him from a world that, in his fractured perception, no longer existed. His sad story, once a footnote in the town's history, was now understood as a tragic confluence of mental illness and unfortunate circumstance. There was no malice, only profound delusion. For Sarah, the quiet moments were the most profound. Watching Jacob relearn to ride a bicycle, or seeing him tentatively explore the internet, a technology that barely existed when he vanished, filled her with a bittersweet joy. There were years to catch up on. 10 years of birthdays, Christmases, first days of school. They started small. A simple birthday cake for his 19th birthday, just the two of them, relishing the quiet normalcy. A trip to the local library where Jacob, once captivated by fairy tales, discovered a voracious appetite for history books, as if trying to re-establish the timeline of the world he'd missed. The old blue binoculars, the catalyst for it all, sat on Jacob's bedside table, a silent testament to his incredible journey and Sarah's unwavering resolve. He didn't play with them anymore, but sometimes Sarah would see him just looking at them, a faint, thoughtful expression on his face. He'd told her how he'd carefully left them on the old farm, hoping, somehow, someone would find them. How he'd drawn the map in the book, convinced that if his mother saw light and home, she would know where to look. He was just a child when he started leaving these breadcrumbs, an instinctively clever boy trying to find his way back. The relentless love of a mother, they said, could move mountains. Sarah had moved oceans of grief, scaled mountains of doubt, and navigated a decade of darkness. She had held on to a thread of hope so thin it had been invisible to everyone else, but she had seen it, felt it, and followed it with every ounce of her being. One crisp autumn evening, Sarah sat on the porch swing, a blanket draped over her knees. Jacob was inside, humming softly as he washed dishes, a domestic sound that still felt miraculous. The lighthouse beam swept across the dark sea in the distance, a comforting rhythm. She closed her eyes, no longer seeing the frantic flash of police lights or the shadowed outlines of a lost boy. She saw Jacob's freckled face, his developing smile, the future stretching out before them, finally whole. The road ahead for them would be long, filled with challenges and new adjustments, but they would walk it together. Mother and son, reunited at last, their bond forged anew in the crucible of loss and the triumph of an unbreakable love. The shadows of Brookhaven had lifted, replaced by the quiet, steady light of a new beginning.